So the principle of contrast. Contrast principles explain the color wheel basically. The opposite colors in the color wheel create contrast in your composition. So you see a small color wheel right now in front of you, in which you see yellow is completely opposite to purple, red is completely opposite to green, and blue is completely opposite to orange. So these colors which are completely opposite to each other in the color wheel create contrast. You must be thinking कि contrast का principle जो है वो हमने पिछले session में भी पढ़ा है. But as I said, कि principles of arts are applied at all forms of visual arts. तो photography में भी उसका application होता है. But here the principle of contrast is more or less the same, which we studied in the last session. लेकिन इसके अंदर थोड़ी सी डिटेल और ज्यादा हम डिस्कस करेंगे. सो कॉन्ट्रास्ट का प्रिंसिपल तो आपको क्लियर हो गया, एंड ब्लैक का कॉन्ट्रास्ट व्हाइट होता है. नाउ देयर इज अ फ्यू मोर डिटेल्स इन दिस कॉन्ट्रास्ट विच इज हाई कॉन्ट्रास्ट एंड लो कॉन्ट्रास्ट इन फोटोग्राफी. सो स्पेशली यू शुड अंडरस्टैंड लो कॉन्ट्रास्ट क्या होता है, हाई कॉन्ट्रास्ट क्या होता है. कॉन्ट्रास्ट की जैसे मैंने आपके प्रीवियसली सेशन में भी डिस्कस किया कि ऑपोजिट कलर्स ऑफ द कलर व्हील होते हैं. सो यू सी द पिक्चर ऑन द राइट टॉप विच इज जस्ट वन फ्लावर, वन रेड फ्लावर एंड द ग्रीनरी इन द बैकग्राउंड. सो दिस काइंड ऑफ अ इमेज explains the principle of contrast between red and green. So in the image above, the contrast is less, and the image below, the contrast is high. Why the image above has low contrast and the image below has high contrast? Because of the ratio of the colors used in these images. ऊपर जो इमेज है उसमें आप देख रहे हैं कि रेड का रेशो कम है, ग्रीन का रेशो ज्यादा है, और नीचे वाला जो इमेज है उसमें आप देख रहे हैं कि ग्रीन का रेशो और रेड का रेशो ऑलमोस्ट इक्वल है. So the image which you see right now in front of you, you see a lot of contrast, but you see that yellow is a color in the color wheel जिसका contrast होता है purple. बट इट इज नॉट नेसेसरी कि एग्जैक्टली पर्पल ही आप यूज करें तो वो हाई कॉन्ट्रास्ट होगा. जब आप पर्पल यूज करेंगे येलो के साथ तो वो हाई कॉन्ट्रास्ट है, लेकिन येलो के साथ पर्पल के अलावा कोई और कलर यूज किया है विच स्टिल पॉप्स आउट येलो, लेकिन वो एग्जैक्टली पर्पल नहीं है. सच एज इन दिस केस जो स्टोन है वो थोड़ा सा अर्दी टोन का है, बट स्टिल इट्स पॉपिंग आउट येलो. सो कॉन्ट्रास्ट का लेवल थोड़ा कम है. सो दिस इज लो कॉन्ट्रास्ट एज कम्पेयर टू हाई कॉन्ट्रास्ट जो कलर व्हील में होना चाहिए. Similarly, you see in the right picture that yellow is placed behind uske sky, that is blue. So blue is in color wheel, it's blue is not exactly the opposite to yellow. In fact, yellow के opposite purple होना है. लेकिन आप देख रहे हो sky के अंदर थोड़े से purple tones भी आते हैं blue के साथ. In this picture, you see a very high contrast of black and white. In this picture, you see a complete contrast which is as per the color wheel, red and green. Here you see yellow, but again yellow का contrast purple होना चाहिए अगर high contrast पे काम कर रहे हैं आप. लेकिन इस picture में green है और कहीं कहीं पर छोटे छोटे purple का cast भी आपको नजर आता है because of the light environment at that particular time. Again here the actual contrast on color wheel which is high contrast is red and green, but in this case green तो है लेकिन red की जगह fuchsia color है which is hot pink कहलाता है ये. It's not completely red, but this is also explaining the principle of contrast. The next principle which is very important is fill your frame. So when you're using the principle of fill your frame in photography, this means that going closer to your subjects. Now going closer, what does going closer means? So when your subject is a still life, you can go as close as you want. But let's say if you're photographing humans, even then you can go as close as you want, but there is a limit of distortion. You don't want your images to be distorted. तो आपको angles का बड़ा ख्याल रखना पड़ता है. So going close in a way means actually going close to the subject or zooming in with if you're using a DSLR camera. So you can zoom in your lens instead of actually going close to your subject. But in case of smartphone cameras, I would not recommend you to zoom in. The reason is कि जब आप स्मार्टफोन कैमरा से जूम इन करते हो तो जो पिक्सल्स हैं वो डिस्टॉर्ट हो जाते हैं, वो लेस नंबर ऑफ पिक्सल्स पर इंच हो जाते हैं, तो आपका इमेज जो है वो नॉइजी लगता है, वो ब्लर्ड लगता है, वो पिक्सलेटेड लगता है, इट डजंट लुक्स गुड. So in case of smartphone cameras, you'll actually have to go close to the subject. Or if you're using a lens attachment of zoom lens on smartphone camera, so then you can actually zoom in like the same way you do it on DSLR camera. So the examples of fill your frame is in front of you. So the photographer in the first picture obviously has used a zoom lens because you cannot go that close to a line with your camera. Similarly, on the picture in the center is only focusing the face of the model, and on the right is the extreme close-up option, which is fill your frame with the eyes of your subject. In this image, you see the eyes are and the part of the face is in the frame, which is actually representing going closer to your frame, which is fill your frame. Here you see the portrait of a lion. Obviously, this is also taken with a zoom lens. Now, the principle of frame within a frame. This principle is also very important to compose and frame your photographs in a way कि वो viewer को appealing लगे. So in this particular case, एक तो frame वो है जो आपकी व्यू फाइंडर से आपको नजर आ रहा है if you're using a DSLR camera. एक frame वो है जो आपकी LCD पे आपको सेल फोन की स्क्रीन पे नजर आ रहा है. That is a frame which is in case of smartphone cameras. Now, as a photographer, you need to find another frame within a frame. एक तो frame है आपके पास. So now in the surrounding, you'll find frames around you, either in man-made structures or in nature. So let's have a look at the examples. So you see on the left side of the image, you see that there is a natural frame. फोटोग्राफर ने केव के अंदर से ये पिक्चर ली है और वो केव की ओपनिंग नजर आ रही है, तो दैट बिकम्स अ नेचुरल फ्रेम फॉर द फोटोग्राफर. तो दिस इज फ्रेम विद इन अ फ्रेम. एक तो फ्रेम उसकी सराउंडिंग है जो DSLR से उसने पिक्चर ली है, एक फ्रेम उसको अंदर मिल गई है विच इज नेचुरल फ्रेम, एंड द सब्जेक्ट इज नेचर. इन द सेकेंड इमेज ऑन द राइट यू सी कि जो मैन मेड स्ट्रक्चर्स के अंदर उसने फ्रेम ढूंढी है, दैट इज अ विंडो. So from a window you see the landscape. The landscape becomes your subject and there's a frame which is window और एक frame तो आपके camera की frame है. So this explains frame within a frame. In this example you see कि man-made structure से frame लिया on the left side of your image, and on the right side the photographer has used the fence और fence के पीछे उसने अपना subject place किया. So that is frame within a frame. In this image, you find a natural frame which the photographer has found around. In this, the frame has been made through the branches of the trees, and the subject is the mountain behind it. In this image, you see door as a frame. Again, here a door. Now, these are two examples which I explain my students to do when you applying the principle of frame within a frame. So the two options could be that the first option on the left in the image, and you see that the subject is in between the photographer and the frame, and on the image on your right, the frame is in between the subject and the photographer. So these are two options of frame within a frame. You should explore all these options. Our last principle for today is leading lines. So leading lines is basically when photographers plan to take such pictures in which photographers find lines in the environment. Those lines are used in such a way कि वो viewer को outside of the frame, inside of the frame invite कर रहे हो, because they lead your attention from outside of the frame to inside of the frame of your composition. तो example of such leading lines would be a lot. Nature में भी आपको leading lines मिलेंगी, man-made structures में भी आपको leading lines मिलेंगी. Now these lines could be diagonal lines, S curves, Z curves. You'll find S curves and Z curves in nature. In man-made structures, you'll find vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal lines, leading the viewer's eye inside the frame. So the examples could be the image on your left, you see a pathway, और pathway के साथ एक fence भी है, crooked line है. It's an organic line actually. So the organic line is actually leading you inside the frame where you see a house at the end. And that makes you look more curious as a viewer because you want to go to that particular part जहाँ आपको आपकी eye lead कर रही है उस photograph में. The image on your right is explaining you the S curve leading lines. The image on your left again is the arrangement of the rocks. उसकी वजह से एक line create हो रही है उस rocks की arrangements की वजह से. That is leading you inside the frame. The image on your right, you see the organic lines of the trees and its branches, और उसका reflection जो lake में नजर आ रहा है उसकी वजह से एक leading lines, it's leading you inside the frame. The image on your left, you see the river flowing organic in an organic way, जो frame के अंदर lead कर रहा है. Similarly, in man-made structures, you see marks on the roads or footpaths or walkways, उनकी भी एक lines बनती हैं. Roads basically जब आप picture लेते हो roads की, तो आप जहाँ पे जो आपकी position है वहाँ से आप picture ले रहे हो तो वहाँ से broad है. जो ही आगे perspective की वजह से narrow हो जाता है shot. So that leads you inside the frame. This image would lead you inside the frame because there is a mark on the road that is leading you inside the frame. फिर जो subject है आपका which is this labor, उसके पीछे जो एक fence बना हुआ है वो stone से वो that is leading you inside the frame. And then the subject itself and the tool in his hand जो कि थोड़ा सा diagonal है horizontal. आगे आप देखते हैं again इसके अंदर भी pathways road की जो edges हैं उसकी वजह से it's creating the principle of leading lines. And the corridors, because of the 2-point perspective, सब चीज़ें एक जगह पर converge हो रही हैं at single vanishing point, उसकी वजह से principle of leading lines जो है वो represent होता है. Now, principles तो हमने discuss कर लिए. Apart from this, there are some additional elements and tips which, as a photographer, you should keep in your mind while capturing your images. Now, always remember the right brain, that is creative side of the brain, likes odd numbers. So use 1 rather than 2 in your pictures. Use 3 rather than 4 if you're shooting a number of objects or number of subjects within your frame, within your composition. Use 1, 3, 5. That is aesthetically appealing to the human's mind, the right side of the brain. And you can look for golden hour. Golden hour is the sunset time. You can look for the blue hour, which is right after golden time. So the image on your left, you see that tree is cropped out of the frame, which doesn't look nice. It is not satisfying image. But the image on your right, जो ट्री है पूरा फ्रेम के अंदर आ गया, दैट इज मोर सेटिस्फाइंग. सो डू नॉट क्रॉप आउट योर सब्जेक्ट फ्रॉम द फ्रेम if possible. So be creative with these rules, have fun, enjoy these rules, break these rules. This is end of the session. See you next week. Till then, take care.